Picture this. A young woman stands in the shadows of a grand palace, her crown lying shattered at her feet. She gave up everything for love, only to discover her husband was already married to another. Her own brother, the infamous Henry VIII, orchestrated her escape from one prison only to trap her in another kind of betrayal entirely. This is the story of Margaret Tudor, the sister history tried to erase, the woman who outmaneuvered the most dangerous king in England, and the forgotten princess whose bloodline would ultimately rule an empire. So ask yourself this: if blood is supposedly thicker than water, why did theirs turn to deadly poison? Close your eyes and step into the year 1489. The air is thick with the scent of burning wood and the whispers of courtiers plotting in darkened corridors. A baby's cry pierces through the stone walls of Greenwich Palace. But this isn't just any cry. This is the sound that would change the course of British history forever. Margaret Tudor has just entered the world, and from her very first breath, she wasn't born to live for herself. She was born to be sold, traded, and sacrificed on the altar of political ambition. Her father, Henry VII, paces the marble floors like a caged wolf. His crown sits uneasily on his head, still warm from the blood of Richard III. He knows that divine right means nothing when you've seized power through violence. What he needs are alliances, unbreakable bonds forged in matrimony and sealed with royal blood. And what better currency exists than innocent daughters? Watch as little Margaret takes her first steps through the golden corridors of Eltham Palace. She doesn't toddle toward toys or reach for her mother's embrace. Instead, she's guided toward maps, toward portraits of foreign princes, toward a future written in treaties and marriage contracts. While other children learn nursery rhymes, Margaret learns the names of kingdoms. While others play with dolls, she studies the faces of potential husbands she'll never choose for herself. The palace buzzes with the energy of her siblings. There's young Henry, already showing signs of the tyrannical appetite that would one day terrorize England. And sweet Mary, practicing her French pronunciation for the court that would eventually adore her. But Margaret is different. There's something in her eyes, a spark of defiance that makes the Tudors nervous and the courtiers whisper. She asks too many questions, challenges too many assumptions. She doesn't just accept her fate, she studies it, memorizes it, and perhaps, just perhaps, begins to plot against it. Picture the scene. Margaret is only 6 years old, her tiny fingers struggling to hold a quill as grown men in elaborate robes discuss her future around a massive oak table. The words "perpetual peace" echo through the chamber like a prayer, but all Margaret hears is King James IV of Scotland and 22 years old. She doesn't understand marriage yet, doesn't comprehend what it means to belong to a man she's never met. All she knows is that the adults speak about her as if she's already gone, as if her childhood ended the moment the ink dried on that treaty. The years blur together like pages turning in a storybook. Margaret grows taller, more beautiful, more aware of the cage being built around her. She watches her mother, Queen Elizabeth of York, glide through the palace like a ghost, forever graceful but never truly free. Is this what marriage means? Is this what queens become? The question haunts Margaret's dreams, but there's no one to answer it. No one to tell her that she has choices. No one to whisper that she doesn't have to follow this path. Then comes the year 1503, and everything Margaret thought she knew about loss crumbles into dust. Picture her standing in a nursery that smells of death and roses, staring at the tiny coffin of her newborn sibling. The baby lived for only 9 days, and now the palace mourns in heavy silence. But before Margaret can even process this grief, another blow strikes with devastating force. Her mother, the elegant Queen Elizabeth, collapses and dies within a week of giving birth. Margaret's world doesn't just change, it explodes into 1,000 sharp pieces. One moment she's mourning her mother's empty chambers, breathing in the lingering scent of rosewater and tears, and the next moment her father's guards are packing her belongings. You leave for Scotland in a fortnight, they tell her, as if she's cargo being shipped to market. No time to grieve. No time to say goodbye to the only home she's ever known. Just duty, always duty, wrapped in the suffocating cloak of royal obligation. Imagine her final night in England, 13-year-old Margaret sitting by her window, watching the stars fade into dawn. Does she dream of escape? Does she fantasize about running through the countryside, living as a peasant girl with dirt under her nails and freedom in her heart? Or has she already accepted that queens don't get to choose their own stories? The journey north unfolds like a funeral procession dressed as a celebration. Hundreds of courtiers, wagons loaded with dowry treasures, and Margaret herself, riding in a golden carriage that feels more like a beautiful prison cell. Every mile takes her further from everything familiar, closer to a future she never wanted but cannot refuse. The Scottish landscape stretches endlessly before her, wild and beautiful and terrifying. Edinburgh Castle rises from the mist like something from a fairy tale, but Margaret knows better than to believe in happy endings. The real King James IV waits for her in the Great Hall, and when she first sees him, her breath catches in her throat. He's not the monster she'd imagined. He's handsome, cultured, beloved by his people. When he leaps onto his horse without touching the stirrups and then lifts her up to ride beside him through the cheering crowds, Margaret feels something she'd never expected: hope. Their wedding at Holyrood Abbey should have been the beginning of her fairy tale. James treats her with genuine kindness, even affection. He doesn't simply use her as a political pawn. He seems to actually enjoy her company. For brief, shining moments, Margaret allows herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she's found something real in this arranged marriage. Maybe love can grow where only duty was planted, but watch as hope transforms into heartbreak, as Margaret's body becomes a battlefield of lost dreams. 6 times she feels life quicken within her. 6 times she decorates a nursery and chooses names and imagines tiny fingers wrapped around her own. And 5 times she buries her babies before they can even learn her voice. Only little James survives, her precious son, the future king who carries all her hopes in his infant smile. The palace that once echoed with wedding celebrations now whispers with grief. Margaret moves through the corridors like a mourning ghost, her arms aching for the children she'll never hold again. But there's no time for self-pity, no luxury of private sorrow. The world outside her nursery is growing darker by the day. When news arrives that her father Henry VII has died, Margaret feels something die inside her too. Her younger brother Henry now wears the English crown, and with it comes an appetite for war that threatens everything she's tried to build in Scotland. Watch as Margaret stands between 2 kingdoms, 2 loyalties, 2 loves that are about to destroy each other. Picture her in the weeks before the Battle of Flodden, pacing her chambers as nightmares plague her sleep. She sees James falling, over and over, tumbling from great heights into darkness. These aren't just dreams. They're prophecies written in a mother's terror and a wife's intuition. She begs James not to march to war, but what power does a woman's voice have against the call of honor and alliance? September 9th, 1513. Margaret sits alone in Linlithgow Palace, her hands pressed against the cool stone walls as if she can feel the earth trembling beneath 10,000 dying men. She knows, without being told, that James is gone. Her beloved husband, the father of her child, the one man who'd shown her kindness in a world built on cruelty, lies dead on a battlefield soaked with Scottish blood. But the cruelest blow comes later, delivered like a gift wrapped in silk and malice. Her sister-in-law, Catherine of Aragon, sends James's blood-stained coat to Henry as a trophy of victory. Imagine Margaret holding that tattered fabric, smelling her husband's last breath still clinging to the wool, knowing that her own family celebrates his death while she drowns in grief. At 24, Margaret stands over her husband's grave with a toddler on her hip and another child growing in her belly. The Scottish lords circle her like vultures, their eyes hungry for power and their hearts filled with suspicion. She's not just a widow now. She's a regent, the ruler of a kingdom that barely tolerates her existence. They whisper that she's English first and Scottish second, that she'll sell their secrets to her brother Henry. They're not entirely wrong to worry. Watch Margaret navigate the treacherous waters of Scottish politics, her pregnancy making her movements slow and careful while her enemies move swift as striking snakes. Every decision she makes is questioned. Every order she gives is debated. The nobles who once bowed to her now argue openly in her presence, their respect buried with James on Flodden Field. Spring brings the birth of Alexander, James's final gift to her, but also new complications that will ultimately destroy everything she's fought to protect. Enter Archibald Douglas, young and charming and devastatingly handsome. He arrives at court like a warm breeze after a harsh winter, paying Margaret the kind of attention she's starved for since James's death. Picture the moment Margaret first sees Archibald across the great hall, the way candlelight catches the gold in his hair and makes his smile seem like pure sunshine. She's been lonely for so long, grieving for so long that his attention feels like resurrection itself. When he whispers sweet words in her ear and makes her laugh for the first time in months, rational thought abandons her completely. The elopement happens quickly, secretly, desperately. Margaret and Archibald steal away in the night like lovers in a romantic ballad, but this isn't a story with a happy ending. By marrying him, Margaret has just forfeited her crown, her authority, and her right to raise her own children. The clause in James's will was clear. She could rule only while she remained a widow. But here's where the fairy tale turns into a nightmare worthy of the darkest tragedy. Archibald Douglas, the man Margaret sacrificed everything to marry, has been lying to her from the very beginning. He's already engaged to another woman. Some sources suggest he might even be married already. Margaret hasn't just lost her crown for love. She's lost it for a man who never belonged to her in the first place. Watch as the Scottish lords descend upon her like avenging angels, demanding she surrender not just her throne, but her children as well. Little King James and baby Alexander are torn from her arms and placed in the care of men who view her as a traitor. Imagine the sound Margaret makes as her sons are carried away, a wail that echoes through the castle corridors like the cry of a wounded animal. Desperate and broken, Margaret turns to the one person who might save her, her brother Henry VIII. But Henry's help comes with strings attached, chains disguised as kindness. He arranges her escape from Scotland not out of love, but out of necessity. Margaret is still his heir, after all, and he needs her alive and under his control. The journey south is a parade of humiliation. Margaret, pregnant again and gravely ill, travels through the countryside she once ruled as a queen, now reduced to a refugee begging for her brother's mercy. She gives birth to her daughter alone, far from home, surrounded by strangers who view her as a cautionary tale about the dangers of female ambition. Then comes news that shatters what remains of her heart. Little Alexander is dead. Her baby boy, barely 2 years old, has died in the care of the Scottish nobles who promised to protect him. Margaret's grief transforms into rage, and she does what any desperate mother would do. She accuses the Duke of Albany of poisoning her child, her voice carrying across kingdoms like a curse. Is it true? Did Albany murder an innocent child to secure his own power? Or is Margaret's accusation the product of a mother's grief-stricken madness? History doesn't provide clear answers, but it does show us a woman pushed beyond the limits of human endurance, lashing out at a world that has taken everything she loved. By 1517, Margaret returns to Scotland, older and infinitely wiser about the true nature of men and power. But her education in betrayal isn't finished yet. Archibald Douglas, the husband who destroyed her life, is now openly living with his mistress while spending Margaret's money like water. Picture her discovering this final insult, watching from her window as her husband parades his lover through the very courtyard where they once pledged eternal devotion. Divorce in the 16th century isn't just complicated, it's nearly impossible, especially for women. But Margaret Tudor isn't just any woman. She's learned to play the game of politics as skillfully as any man, and she's about to demonstrate exactly how dangerous a clever woman can become when properly motivated. Watch as Margaret forms an unlikely alliance with the Duke of Albany, the same man she once accused of murdering her child. Politics makes strange bedfellows, and survival requires even stranger choices. Together, they orchestrate a coup that strips Archibald Douglas of his power and influence, sending him fleeing to foreign courts like a common criminal. The scene is almost poetic in its justice. Margaret marching into Edinburgh not beside a king or a husband, but beside her former enemy, reclaiming power through sheer force of will and strategic brilliance. It's revenge, yes, but it's also something more profound. It's a woman refusing to be broken by the men who tried to destroy her. Of course, gossips immediately begin whispering about Margaret's relationship with Albany. A queen can't ally herself with a powerful man without rumors of romance following close behind. But Margaret has learned not to care what people whisper in corners. She has bigger concerns than protecting her reputation from wagging tongues. The betrayals continue to come, each one a fresh knife wound in her already scarred heart. Isabella Hopringle, a nun Margaret trusted completely, turns out to be a spy in holy robes, feeding information about Margaret's household directly to Henry VIII. When the Scottish authorities discover Isabella's treachery, they're ready to punish the entire convent for harboring a traitor. Here, Margaret reveals the complexity of her character once again. Despite Isabella's betrayal, despite the danger to her own position, Margaret intervenes to save her friend. She gives Isabella a second chance, an act of mercy that would be touching if Isabella didn't immediately return to her spying. Some people, Margaret learns, are incapable of redemption, no matter how much forgiveness you offer them. The political chaos continues to swirl around Margaret like a perpetual storm. Scotland and England dance on the edge of war, pulling back only when diplomats manage to fire off enough desperate letters to prevent complete catastrophe. Through it all, Margaret watches her son James grow into a young king, knowing that every political decision she makes affects not just her own future, but his as well. In 1524, 14-year-old James officially claims his throne, and Margaret finds herself facing a new kind of powerlessness. She's no longer regent, no longer the power behind the throne. She's simply the king's mother, and mothers, as she's learning, have very little authority over grown sons, even when those sons are still children themselves. But her most bitter fight still rages on, the personal war against Archibald Douglas that threatens to consume everything else in her life. Despite pressure from Henry VIII to reconcile with her estranged husband, Margaret remains laser-focused on ending their marriage once and for all. She stripped Douglas of power, sent him into exile twice, and even threatened war to keep him away from her. When Henry summons Douglas and encourages him to win back Margaret's heart, the reunion goes exactly as poorly as expected. Margaret's rejection is swift and absolute, but Douglas doesn't accept defeat gracefully. He strikes back by storming into Scottish Parliament with his allies, attempting to seize control from both Margaret and the boy king. In desperation, Margaret writes to her former enemy Albany, swearing she'll fight against England itself before she'll let Douglas anywhere near her again. It's a dangerous promise, one that could be interpreted as treason if it falls into the wrong hands. And of course it does. The letter finds its way to Henry VIII, and his response is so furious, so threatening, that Margaret's resolve crumbles completely. Terrified of her brother's wrath, Margaret reverses course and makes peace with Douglas. But it's too late to prevent the catastrophe that follows. The moment Douglas gains even a sliver of power, he uses it to hold 14-year-old King James essentially hostage, refusing to let the boy return to his mother's care. Picture Margaret's anguish during those 3 years when she cannot see her son, cannot protect him from his stepfather's influence. She tries everything, schemes and pleads and bargains, but Douglas holds all the cards. When James finally breaks free on his own and returns to his mother's side, he barely recognizes the woman she's become. By this time, Margaret has found comfort with a new companion, Henry Stuart, a nobleman whose rapid rise in her favor raises eyebrows throughout the Scottish court. She grants him titles and privileges, stirring resentment among the established lords who see him as an upstart interloper. Soon, the pair are living together openly, and whispers spread like wildfire about a possible secret pregnancy. Margaret's urgency for divorce becomes impossible to ignore, especially when she discovers the perfect legal grounds for ending her marriage to Douglas. His previous engagement, possibly even marriage, to another woman before their wedding gives Margaret exactly what she needs to be declared legally free. But freedom, Margaret discovers, doesn't necessarily lead to wisdom. Instead of savoring her independence, she rushes immediately into marriage with Henry Stuart, now Lord Methven. It's as if she cannot exist without a husband, cannot define herself except in relation to a man who might protect or destroy her. Tragically, history repeats itself with crushing predictability. Methven turns out to be just as unfaithful and financially irresponsible as Douglas, keeping a mistress and squandering Margaret's funds with reckless abandon. A decade into this new union, Margaret finds herself seeking yet another divorce, trapped in a cycle of hope and betrayal that seems destined to repeat endlessly. After June 1528, when James V steps fully into his royal power, Margaret discovers that being the king's mother grants her no special privileges in his court. The woman who once ruled as regent now holds no official position, wields no political influence. She's become a petitioner in her own son's kingdom, begging for favors she once granted with a wave of her hand. Their relationship has soured beyond repair, poisoned by years of political maneuvering and personal betrayals. James refuses Margaret's requests, including her desperate pleas for another divorce. Behind the scenes, the real poison in their relationship is Margaret's secret correspondence with Henry VIII, sharing sensitive information about Scottish politics with her son's greatest rival and enemy. When James discovers his mother's treachery, the silence that follows is more devastating than any screaming argument could have been. Margaret has lost not just her political power but her son's love, and both losses are entirely of her own making. The woman who outmaneuvered kings and survived countless betrayals has finally betrayed herself. By 1543, Margaret Tudor's world has shrunk to the size of her writing desk, where she composes letter after desperate letter to Henry VIII. She begs him to send back her daughter, Lady Margaret Douglas, who has followed so closely in her mother's scandalous footsteps that she's earned her own stay in the Tower of London for falling in love with the wrong courtier. Though eventually freed, the younger Margaret never returns to Scotland and never sees her mother again. The pattern of loss continues unbroken. Mothers and daughters separated by politics and pride and the unforgiving nature of royal life. In her final years, Margaret has ceased to be anyone's trusted confidant or valued ally. Her sharp tongue and relentless ambition have alienated her brother, her son, and nearly every powerful person she once called friend. Even after she and James reconcile, their shared moments are fleeting and strained, more obligation than affection. On October 18, 1541, after suffering a stroke, Margaret Tudor dies alone at the age of 51. She calls for James, but he doesn't arrive in time to hold her hand or offer forgiveness for the years of hurt between them. Her final breath comes in solitude, surrounded by servants rather than family, by duty rather than love. But here's where Margaret Tudor's story takes its most unexpected turn, where the woman, dismissed as scandalous and shameful, has her ultimate revenge on history itself. While her brother Henry VIII left behind a fractured dynasty and no surviving legitimate grandchildren, Margaret quietly ensured the future of the British crown through her own bloodline. She became the grandmother of Mary Queen of Scots and the great-great-grandmother of James I, who would ultimately inherit the English throne and unite the crowns of Scotland and England under a single ruler. The British royal family today traces its lineage not through Henry's troubled line, but through Margaret Tudor, the so-called scandalous sister, who dared to love unwisely and live boldly in an age that demanded women be silent and obedient. In the end, history crowned not the king who ruled through fear and violence, but the sister who survived him through sheer stubborn determination. Margaret Tudor, the woman who gave up her crown for love and lost everything she thought mattered, ultimately gave Britain its future. She had the last laugh, after all, echoing through the centuries in the bloodline that still sits on the throne today. The woman they tried to erase from history became its most important architect, proving that sometimes the greatest victories come not from the battles we win, but from the simple act of refusing to disappear, no matter how many times the world tries to break us.